The shovel hit something solid beneath the frozen ground, and Ethan froze as Ranger let out a low warning growl, his ears locked on the earth, like it was breathing beneath them just hours before the blizzard buried everything. He had been digging a simple tunnel from his cabin to the old barn, just to survive winter, but this wasn't dirt anymore. This was wood too smooth, too placed. Ranger started clawing fast, desperate, snow shaking from his back, as a hidden hatch cracked open, releasing a faint pulse of warm air from below. Ethan leaned closer, heart pounding, as a distant metallic echo rose from the darkness. Something was still moving down there, and it wasn't the wind. Some tunnels are not built to escape the winter, but to find what the winter is hiding. The first strike of the shovel sounded dull against the frozen earth, a hollow note that lingered longer than it should have in the stillness of the forest, and Ethan Caldwell paused, breath turning to pale smoke in the air, as snow drifted softly through the skeletal branches above, each flake falling with a quiet patience that made the world feel slower than time itself. Ranger stood a few feet behind him, the German shepherd's broad chest rising steadily, amber eyes fixed not on Ethan but on the ground beneath him, ears lifted high as if catching a rhythm too faint for human senses. The cabin sat behind them, a weathered structure of gray wood and stubborn survival, while the old barn rested just under 70 yards away across a stretch of land that winter had already begun to claim. Ethan wiped his gloved hands against his jacket and drove the shovel down again, the metal cutting through layers of frost and packed soil with a resistance that felt almost deliberate. He had started the tunnel 2 days ago, a straight line from cabin to barn, something practical, something necessary, because once the snow came in full, walking that short distance could become impossible. He had learned that the hard way the year before, when the storm sealed the door and silence pressed so heavily it felt like the world had forgotten him entirely. Ranger shifted suddenly, paused, stepping closer, his nails clicking faintly against a patch of exposed rock. Then he stopped, head tilting slightly, a low sound rising from his chest. Not quite a growl, not fear, but recognition. Ethan noticed it the way he noticed everything Ranger did, not immediately, but deeply, like an echo settling into place. He leaned on the shovel and listened, but the forest offered nothing in return. No wind, no movement, just that same heavy stillness that made even his own heartbeat feel too loud. "You hear something, boy?" he murmured. Though the question carried more hope than expectation, Ranger didn't look at him. Instead, the dog stepped forward and pressed one paw against the trench Ethan had been digging, his nose lowering to the cold ground. Inhaling slowly as if reading something written beneath the surface, Ethan frowned, then drove the shovel down once more. This time the sound changed, a sharper crack, not earth, not stone, something else, something placed. He froze again, the handle still vibrating in his grip, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor beneath his boots, so soft it could have been imagined, but Ranger reacted instantly, stepping back, ears pinned forward, body tense with a focus that erased everything else. Snow began to fall thicker now, the sky dimming into a pale gray ceiling, and for a moment Ethan felt that familiar weight return, the one that came with isolation, with memory, with the quiet understanding that out here, if something was wrong, there was no one else to see it, no one else to hear it. He knelt slowly, brushing away the loose dirt with his gloved hands, revealing a surface that should not have been there, smooth, aged wood, darkened by time and buried beneath layers that suggested it had been hidden long before he ever set foot on this land. Ranger let out a soft, urgent whine, stepping closer again, his paw hovering just above the exposed plank as if waiting for permission. Ethan swallowed, his breath catching not from the cold, but from the realization forming quietly in his chest. He hadn't just been digging a path between two buildings, he had been digging towards something, something that had been waiting beneath the ground through seasons, through storms, through years of silence, and now, as the first true edge of winter settled into the air around them, it had decided to answer back. And somewhere deep below, too deep to measure, something shifted in response, slow, steady, and undeniably real, as if the earth itself had taken a breath after a very long sleep. The wood felt colder than the soil around it, not just from the frozen ground, but from something older, something that had not seen light in a very long time. and Ethan kept his hand resting on it longer than necessary, as if trying to understand it through touch alone. The grain was too straight, too deliberate to be random debris. This had been placed here, built here, buried with purpose. Ranger shifted beside him, pacing once in a tight circle before stopping again at the same spot, his focus unbroken, his tail low but steady, not fear, not panic, just awareness, the kind that came before a storm or before something changed. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath drifting across the surface of the wood like fog over a lake. Then he reached for the shovel again, not with urgency, but with care, each movement slower now, more deliberate. He cleared the edges of the plank, revealing corners, straight lines, a seam running across the middle that suggested it was not just a piece of wood, but a door, or a cover, or something meant to open. Snow began to gather on his shoulders, light at first, then steadier, each flake landing without sound, and the world around him seemed to narrow to just this small space between the cabin and the barn, as if everything else had stepped back to watch. Ranger let out a quiet huff and lowered his head, pressing his nose along the edge of the seam. Then he looked up at Ethan with an intensity that needed no translation. This mattered, Ethan swallowed, his gloved fingers brushing away the last layer of dirt along the edge until the outline became clear. A rectangular hatch, no larger than 4 feet across, set deep enough that it would never have been found by accident. He sat back on his heels for a moment, letting the realization settle. This land had been here long before him, before the cabin, before the barn, before whatever story he thought he was living. And now it was offering something back, or revealing something that had never truly been gone. The wind picked up slightly, threading through the trees with a low whisper that carried across the clearing. And for a second Ethan thought he felt it beneath his hands too. Not wind. Not quite. But a faint shift, like air moving somewhere below. Ranger stiffened again, ears lifting, his body angled toward the hatch as if he could hear something rising through it. Ethan leaned closer, placing his ear near the wood. At first there was nothing. Only the distant hush of snowfall and the soft creak of branches under weight. But then, just beneath that silence, there it was, a sound so faint it could have been imagined. A hollow echo, spaced out, steady, like something tapping or pulsing far below the surface. He pulled back slowly, his heart beating a little faster now. Not from fear but from recognition. He had heard patterns like that before, in places where structure mattered, where space carried sound in ways open air could not. This was not just empty ground beneath them. Ranger let out a soft whine, then lifted his paw and placed it directly on the center of the hatch, holding it there, unmoving, as if marking it, as if saying this was the point where everything changed. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, then shifted his weight forward and gripped the edge of the seam with both hands. The wood resisted at first, frozen into place by time and cold, but he adjusted his grip, bracing his boots against the packed soil, and pulled again. A faint crack echoed outward as the seal broke, the sound carrying into the trees and fading into the gray sky above. Ranger stepped back just enough to give space, but did not take his eyes off the opening. Slowly, carefully, the hatch lifted an inch, then another, releasing a thin breath of air that slipped past Ethan's face, warmer than the world outside, carrying a scent that did not belong to winter, not pine, not snow, something older, something enclosed. He paused, holding the hatch halfway open, letting that air rise, letting it speak in its own quiet way. His mind moved through possibilities, old storage, forgotten cellar, maybe something built by the original owners of the land. But none of those explanations fully settled the feeling in his chest, because this did not feel forgotten, it felt preserved, like something had been waiting rather than abandoned. Ranger leaned forward again, his nose lifting, drawing in that same air, and for the first time since Ethan had known him, the dog did not just observe or warn. He hesitated, just for a moment, as if even he was deciding whether to step closer. Ethan noticed that, and it stayed with him longer than anything else, because Ranger did not hesitate without reason. The snow was falling heavier now, soft but constant, beginning to fill the trench behind them, covering the path Ethan had already dug. The world was closing in, quietly, steadily, and whatever lay beneath this hatch was no longer just a discovery, it was becoming a choice. Ethan tightened his grip and lifted the hatch a little higher, enough to reveal darkness below, not the flat darkness of shadow, but a deeper one, layered, carrying depth, as if it opened into space rather than just a hole. He could not see the bottom, but he could feel it, the way the air moved, the way the sound shifted when he leaned closer. Somewhere below, that faint echo came again, steady, patient, as if it had all the time in the world, and for a long moment, Ethan did not move. He simply knelt there between the cabin and the barn, between what he knew and what he did not, with Ranger beside him and winter settling around them. Realizing that the tunnel he had started was no longer just a way to survive the season. It had become something else entirely, something that had been waiting beneath the ground long before he ever picked up a shovel, and now that it had been found, it was no longer silent. The darkness below did not feel empty. It felt occupied by silence itself, layered and patient, as if it had been holding its breath for years and now slowly released it into the cold air above. Ethan kept the hatch open with one hand while the other reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt. The beam flickered once before steadying into a narrow line of pale light that cut through the darkness and revealed the first few feet beneath him. Wooden steps, narrow and worn smooth by time, descending at a slight angle into the earth, not broken, not collapsed, but preserved, as if someone had once used them often and then simply stopped. Ranger moved closer again, careful now, his paws silent against the frozen ground, his head lowered just enough to look down into the opening. Without crossing the edge, his ears angled forward, catching something Ethan could not yet hear clearly. The faint echo returned again, that same steady rhythm, distant but consistent, like something tapping or shifting deep below. Ethan angled the flashlight further, following the line of the steps downward, the beam catching dust particles drifting slowly in the air, not stirred by wind but by movement, subtle and constant. The space below was larger than he expected, not just a shallow cellar but a tunnel, reinforced with wooden beams set at regular intervals, each one darkened with age but still solid. The structure carried a sense of intention, not temporary, not improvised, but built to last, built to endure seasons and years without needing to be seen. He shifted his weight and tested the first step with his boot. The wood held firm, no creak, no give, just a quiet acceptance of pressure. Ranger let out a soft sound behind him, not a warning this time, but something closer to encouragement. Though even that carried caution, Ethan paused again, looking back toward the cabin for a brief moment, its outline now softened by the falling snow, then toward the barn, barely visible through the thickening white. The world above was already beginning to disappear, edges blurring, distances shrinking. Winter was closing in faster than expected, and the tunnel he had started for survival had led him here, to a place that offered something else entirely. He turned back and lowered himself carefully onto the first step, the cold air above brushing past his back, while the warmer air from below met him halfway, creating a strange balance that felt almost intentional, as if the space itself was holding two worlds at once. Ranger hesitated only a second before stepping down after him, his weight distributed carefully, his body low but controlled, staying close enough that Ethan could feel his presence without needing to see it. Step by step they descended, the light from above fading with each movement, replaced by the narrow beam of the flashlight and the soft glow of something deeper within, not bright, not obvious, but present, like a memory that refused to fade. The air changed as they moved, losing the sharp bite of winter and taking on a stillness that carried a faint metallic scent, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Ethan counted the steps without thinking, a habit from another life. 1, 2, 3, each one grounding him in the moment, until he reached what felt like the bottom, where the steps leveled into a narrow corridor stretching forward into darkness, the walls lined with the same wooden supports, evenly spaced, creating a rhythm that echoed with the faint sound he had heard above. He paused there, standing at the threshold between descent and discovery, and listened again. The sound was clearer now, not tapping, not mechanical, but something else, something organic in its timing, steady but not exact, like breathing. Ranger moved ahead slightly, just a few inches, then stopped, his head turning toward the right wall, his nose lifting as if catching a trace of something carried through the still air. Ethan followed his gaze and slowly turned the flashlight in that direction, the beam sliding across the wood until it caught something different, a section of the wall that did not match the rest. The grain was lighter, the edges sharper, as if it had been replaced or opened at some point. The difference was subtle, but once seen it could not be unseen. Ranger stepped closer to that spot and pressed his nose against it, then tapped it lightly with his paw. Once, twice, the same measured pattern he used when signaling something important. Ethan felt a quiet shift inside him. Not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when a question becomes real. He moved closer and reached out, placing his hand against the altered section of the wall. It was warmer than the surrounding wood, not by much, but enough to notice, enough to matter. He held his hand there and closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the sensation settle. The faint rhythm beneath it was stronger here, not loud, but undeniable, like something alive on the other side. Ranger let out a low, steady breath, his body no longer tense but focused, waiting, trusting. Ethan opened his eyes again and traced the edge of the panel with his fingers until he found a slight indentation, almost hidden, a place where the wood gave just enough to suggest movement. He pressed it gently at first. Nothing happened. Then a little firmer, and the panel shifted with a soft, controlled sound. Not a break, not a crack, but a release, like something unlocking after a long time. A narrow gap appeared, just enough to let a thin line of that warmer air slip through, carrying with it a deeper version of that same scent, and something else, something that felt like presence rather than absence. Ethan drew in a slow breath and looked down at Ranger, who met his gaze with a calm that felt almost knowing. And in that quiet exchange, without words, without hesitation, Ethan understood that whatever lay beyond that panel was not just part of the tunnel. It was the reason the tunnel existed at all, and now that it had been found, there was no turning back into the simple purpose he had started with, only forward into whatever had been waiting beneath the ground for someone willing to listen. The panel did not swing open all at once, but yielded slowly, as if it had weight not just from the wood itself, but from the years it had remained closed, and Ethan eased it further with steady hands, the narrow gap widening just enough for the flashlight beam to slip through and reveal what lay beyond. The light traveled forward into a space that felt different from the tunnel behind him, wider, quieter, and held together not just by beams, but by intention. The air that flowed from it carried a softness that did not belong underground, warmer, still, almost preserved. And for a moment Ethan did not move. He simply stood there with the panel half open, listening, feeling, letting the space introduce itself in its own time. Ranger stepped forward first, not crossing fully, but leaning just enough to look through the opening, his ears upright, his posture alert but not tense, his breathing steady, as if whatever was beyond did not signal danger but demanded respect. Ethan followed, lowering himself slightly and guiding the panel open a few more inches until there was enough space to step through. The wood brushed lightly against his shoulder as he crossed the threshold, and the difference was immediate. The temperature shifted by several degrees. The ground beneath his boots was no longer rough-packed soil, but smoother, leveled, reinforced in a way that suggested care, not haste. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the room, revealing walls lined with wooden shelves, some empty, some still holding objects that had not been touched in years, metal containers, glass jars, tools arranged with a quiet order that had not been disturbed. The space was not large, perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet long, but it carried a sense of purpose that extended beyond its size, like a place built not just to store things, but to protect something more important than the objects themselves. Ranger moved in beside him now, stepping fully into the room, his nails making the faintest sound against the smoother surface. He circled once, slowly, his nose tracing the edges of the walls, pausing at certain points as if following a pattern only he could detect. Then he stopped near the far side of the room and turned his head slightly, focusing on something out of view. Ethan followed the direction of his gaze and moved the flashlight beam across the space until it landed on a section of the wall that did not match the rest, not in structure, not in tone. This one was reinforced with a different kind of wood, thicker, more deliberate, and set with a narrow frame that hinted at another opening, smaller than the one he had just passed through, but no less intentional. The faint rhythmic sound was stronger here, no longer something imagined, but something present, something contained within or beyond that second barrier. Ethan felt his breath slow, not out of calm, but out of focus, the kind that narrows everything down to a single point. He stepped closer, each movement measured, aware of the stillness around him, aware of how sound carried in this enclosed space. Ranger did not move ahead this time. Instead, he stayed slightly behind, watching, listening, his body angled toward Ethan, but his attention fixed on the wall, as if he understood that what came next belonged to the man, not the dog. Ethan reached the reinforced section and ran his hand along its surface. The wood was warmer here, more noticeably so, and the faint vibration beneath it was no longer subtle. It moved through his fingertips with a steady pulse, not mechanical, not random, something with rhythm, something that held time within it. He leaned closer, placing his ear near the surface, and the sound resolved itself further, not tapping, not shifting, but something closer to breath, drawn in and released in slow, consistent intervals. He pulled back slightly, his mind searching for explanation, for structure, for anything that would place this within the boundaries of what he knew. But the space resisted that. It did not feel like a forgotten shelter or a storage room left behind. It felt maintained in its own quiet way, not by hands, but by time itself. Ranger let out a soft exhale, almost like a sigh, and then took one step forward, placing his paw gently against the base of the reinforced wall, not scratching, not pushing, just resting it there. The same way he had marked the hatch above. Ethan looked down at him, then back at the wall, and in that moment the connection became clear. This was not the end of the space. It was another threshold, another layer waiting to be crossed. He searched the edges with his fingers again, slower this time, more attentive, until he found it, a small recessed handle, nearly invisible against the grain, worn smooth by use long ago. He hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown that lay beyond. Then he wrapped his fingers around it and applied gentle pressure. The mechanism responded almost immediately, a soft internal shift, followed by a faint release, and the panel began to move inward, not outward like the first, but sliding into the wall with a quiet precision that spoke of careful design. As the opening widened, the air changed again, warmer still, carrying with it a deeper version of that same steady rhythm, now unmistakable, now close. The flashlight beam extended into the new space, and for the first time, the darkness ahead did not feel empty at all. It felt inhabited by something unseen but undeniably present, something that had been waiting in silence, not for years, but for someone willing to come this far. And as Ethan stood there, between what had been hidden and what was about to be revealed, with Ranger steady at his side and the world above buried in snow, he understood that the tunnel he thought he had built was only the beginning of a path that had already been laid long before he arrived. And now, step by step, it was unfolding beneath him. The opening did not reveal itself all at once, but deepened gradually, like a breath being drawn from somewhere far below, and Ethan stepped forward with a caution that felt instinctive rather than forced, the beam of his flashlight stretching into the newly revealed space, catching edges, surfaces, and shapes that did not belong to decay or abandonment, but to preservation. The floor beneath him shifted again, smoother now, almost polished in places, as if movement had once been frequent here, not hurried but consistent, and the air carried a steadiness that felt untouched by the world above. Ranger followed closely, his presence anchored and quiet, his ears still forward, his body no longer tense but attuned, as if whatever lay ahead had already been accepted by him in a way Ethan was only beginning to understand. The space opened wider after a few steps, not dramatically, but enough to feel like a transition from passage to chamber. The walls were reinforced differently here, not just wooden beams but sections of stone integrated into the structure, creating a balance between earth and construction that felt deliberate. The light moved slowly across the surfaces, revealing markings, not words at first glance but patterns, carved lightly into the wood and stone, lines that curved and intersected, forming shapes that seemed more like records than decoration. Ethan paused, his eyes tracing them without fully interpreting, but sensing their purpose. This was not random. This was a place where something had been measured, observed, remembered. Ranger stopped near the center of the chamber, his head lifting slightly as if aligning with something unseen, and then he turned in a slow circle, before settling his gaze toward the far end of the room, where the faint rhythm had grown clearer, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but present in the air itself. Ethan followed, each step bringing the sound into sharper focus. It was steady, patient, like breathing, but deeper, carrying a resonance that moved through the space rather than simply existing within it, the kind of sound that could not be rushed or forced, only approached. The beam of the flashlight reached the far wall and revealed what had been hidden in shadow, a structure set into the stone, not large but precise, framed by a darker border that suggested it had been built as a focal point. Within it was a surface unlike the wood or stone around it, smoother, almost reflective, though dulled by time, and at its center, a small circular indentation, no larger than a hand. The source of the rhythm seemed to come from behind it, or perhaps through it. Ethan slowed as he approached, his breath steady, his senses narrowing. Ranger moved ahead this time, not quickly, but with quiet certainty, stopping just short of the structure and lowering his head slightly, his posture calm, almost reverent. Ethan noticed that, and felt something shift within himself, a recognition that this was not simply a discovery of space, but of intention. He reached out and placed his hand near the circular indentation without touching it. The warmth here was stronger, unmistakable now, and the rhythm beneath it aligned with something inside him, not perfectly, but enough to create a sense of connection, as if two separate patterns had found a moment of overlap. He hesitated only briefly before placing his palm gently against the center. The surface responded not with movement, but with a subtle change. The rhythm deepened, not faster, not louder, but fuller, filling the space around them in a way that felt almost like sound becoming presence. Ranger exhaled softly and sat down beside him, his body relaxed but attentive, as if this moment required stillness rather than action. Ethan kept his hand there, feeling the steady pulse, and for the first time since he had begun digging, the purpose of everything shifted. This was not about survival from winter, not about reaching the barn or avoiding the snow. This was something else entirely. Something that had existed beneath his land long before he arrived, waiting without urgency, without demand, simply existing until it was found. The chamber held that quiet truth in every surface, every line, every measured detail. And as Ethan stood there, hand resting against something that seemed to carry its own form of life, he realized that the path he had uncovered was not meant to be rushed or solved, but understood slowly, one layer at a time. And in that understanding, there was no fear, only a deep and steady awareness that whatever this place had been built for, whatever it had been holding, it had not been lost. It had been waiting, and now, with the snow closing the world above and the silence settling deeper around them, that waiting had come to an end. The moment his hand remained against the surface, the rhythm did not stop. It continued with a calm certainty that felt older than anything Ethan had known, and yet something within it shifted. Not in speed, not in strength, but in awareness, as if the contact itself had been acknowledged, not reacted to, but recognized. The warmth beneath his palm deepened slightly, spreading outward in a slow, steady way that reached through the thin layer of his glove and into his skin, and for a brief second, he had the strange sensation that the space around him was no longer entirely still, that it was listening as much as he was. Ranger remained seated beside him, his posture grounded, his gaze fixed on the same point, but his breathing had changed, slower now, more measured, as if he had settled into a rhythm that matched the one in the wall. Ethan drew a quiet breath and let his hand remain where it was, resisting the instinct to pull away, because nothing about this felt threatening. There was no urgency, no alarm, only a presence that asked for stillness rather than action. And as he stood there, the faint patterns carved into the surrounding surfaces seemed to take on new meaning, not as decoration but as records of something repeated, something observed over time. He glanced around slowly, the flashlight beam moving across the walls again, and this time he noticed the spacing, the consistency, the way each line curved and met another, forming shapes that resembled cycles, waves, or perhaps the passage of something measured not in minutes or hours but in intervals that followed a different kind of time. He He stepped back slightly, his hand lifting from the surface, and the moment it left, the warmth receded just enough to be felt, not gone, but less connected. The rhythm remained, steady and unchanged, as if his presence had not altered it, but simply aligned with it for a brief moment. Ranger stood then, moving closer to the structure, his nose lifting toward the circular indentation, then lowering again, his head tilting slightly, as if listening not just with his ears, but with something deeper. He let out a soft breath and touched his nose lightly against the surface, then stepped back, not in hesitation but in acknowledgement. Ethan watched him, the quiet certainty in the dog's movements grounding him more than any explanation could. He turned his attention back to the chamber, taking in its full shape now, the shelves, the containers, the careful arrangement of everything within reach, and he realized that nothing here had been left in disorder. Even after all this time, dust had settled, but it had not been disturbed. The air had remained still but not stagnant, as if the space had been sealed not just physically but intentionally, preserved in a way that kept it outside the passage of the world above. He moved toward one of the shelves, running his fingers along the edge of a metal container, the surface cool but not cold, the lid secured, untouched, beside it a glass jar filled with something that had long since settled into a uniform stillness, and next to that a small tool, its handle worn smooth from use, placed carefully as if it had been set down with the expectation it would be picked up again. Ethan paused there, the thought forming slowly. This place had not been abandoned. It had been left in readiness, not for return, but for discovery. Ranger shifted again, moving toward the entrance of the chamber, and then back, pacing once in a small arc before stopping and looking toward the passage they had come from. Then back to Ethan, a silent question, or perhaps a reminder. Ethan followed his gaze and realized how quiet it had become, not just in the chamber, but in the tunnel beyond. The faint sounds of the forest above were gone, replaced by a deeper silence that seemed to press gently against the walls. He glanced at his watch out of habit, though time felt less certain here, and saw that more had passed than he expected. The snow above would be falling heavier now, the path he had dug already beginning to disappear. The tunnel he had started for survival had become something else entirely, something that did not lead outward but inward, and yet there was no sense of being trapped, only of being drawn further. He returned his attention to the structure in the wall, stepping closer once more, this time not reaching out immediately, but observing, letting his eyes adjust to the subtle differences in light and shadow, and that was when he noticed it, just below the circular indentation, faint but present, a line that had not been visible before, or perhaps had been too subtle to see, a seam, not like the one on the previous panel, but finer, more precise, as if it had been designed to move only under certain conditions. He leaned in, angling the flashlight carefully, and saw that the seam traced a shape, not rectangular, not circular, but something in between, a form that followed the patterns carved into the walls, echoing their curves and intersections. He reached out again, this time placing his fingers along that seam, not pressing, just resting them there. And the moment he did, the rhythm shifted again, not in pace, but in depth, as if responding to a different point of contact. The surface beneath his fingers felt alive in a way that defied explanation, not warm like a machine, not cold like stone, but balanced, responsive, and for a brief moment, he felt the same alignment as before, that subtle connection where two separate things met in quiet understanding. Ranger stepped closer, standing now at Ethan's side, his shoulder brushing lightly against his leg, a steady presence, a reminder that he was not alone in this. And as the rhythm continued, steady and patient, Ethan understood something that had not been clear before. This place was not revealing itself all at once because it was not meant to be taken in that way. It was unfolding, one layer at a time, responding not to force but to presence, to attention, to the willingness to remain and listen. And with the world above now closing under snow and silence, there was nowhere else to be. Nowhere else that mattered more than this quiet space beneath the ground, where something that had been waiting for a very long time was finally beginning to be understood. The moment his fingers rested along the seam, the chamber seemed to draw inward, not physically but in presence, as if the space itself had shifted its attention toward him. The rhythm beneath the surface deepened again, not louder but more complete, filling the silence in a way that made the air feel heavier yet calmer at the same time. Ethan did not move. He let his hand remain there, feeling the subtle vibration travel through his fingertips and into his palm, up his arm, settling somewhere in his chest where it lingered, steady and quiet. Ranger stood beside him, closer now than before, his shoulder pressed lightly against Ethan's leg, his breathing slow and even, his gaze fixed on the same point. But his ears no longer strained. They rested, angled forward, but relaxed, as if whatever they had been listening for had finally revealed itself in a way that no longer required tension. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, grounding himself, and allowed his focus to narrow to the point of contact. The seam beneath his fingers was not just a line. It was a boundary, a threshold defined with precision, and as he traced it gently, he began to notice that it followed the same patterns carved into the walls, those curved lines and intersections that now felt less like markings and more like instructions, not written in words but in form, guiding movement, guiding understanding. He moved his hand slowly along the seam, following its path, and with each inch the rhythm beneath it responded, not changing but aligning, as if acknowledging the motion, as if recognizing the path being retraced. Ranger shifted slightly, mirroring the movement, his nose lowering to follow the same invisible line, his steps quiet and measured, until they reached the lower edge of the seam, where the shape completed itself in a subtle curve that closed the pattern. Ethan paused there, his hand resting at the point where the line ended, and for a brief moment nothing happened. The rhythm remained steady, unchanged, but the stillness deepened, as if waiting for something more. He glanced down at Ranger, and the dog lifted his head, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange that carried more certainty than words could offer. Ethan understood then that this was not about pressure or force. It was about presence, about completing something that had been left unfinished. He returned his attention to the seam and placed his other hand gently on the opposite side, aligning both palms along the shape. And in that moment the response came, subtle at first, a shift in the surface, a soft internal movement that traveled along the seam like a breath moving through a body. The rhythm deepened once more, not faster, not louder, but fuller, and the seam itself began to separate, not with a crack or a break, but with a smooth, controlled motion. The panel did not swing or slide in a single direction. It unfolded inward in sections, each part moving with quiet precision, revealing a space beyond that carried a different kind of light, not bright, not artificial, but soft and ambient, as if it came from the walls themselves. Ethan stepped back slightly as the opening widened, giving the structure room to complete its movement, and Ranger took a small step forward, his body leaning toward the new space but stopping just short of crossing into it. His ears lifted again, not in alarm but in recognition. The air that flowed from within was warmer still, carrying a faint scent that was neither metallic nor earthy, something cleaner, something untouched by time. And within it the rhythm changed once more, no longer contained, no longer distant, but present in the open space surrounding them. Ethan raised the flashlight instinctively, but the beam felt unnecessary here. The soft ambient light revealed the outlines of the room beyond, smoother surfaces, curved rather than straight, the walls not reinforced but shaped, as if carved or formed with intention beyond simple construction. The space felt larger than the chamber they stood in, though it was difficult to measure, the edges softened by the way the light settled into them, and at the center, just visible, was a structure unlike anything he had seen before, low and circular, its surface reflecting that same soft glow, the source of the rhythm now clearly emanating from it, steady, calm, alive in a way that did not demand explanation but invited understanding. Ethan lowered the flashlight slowly, letting his eyes adjust, letting the new space reveal itself at its own pace. Ranger stepped forward then, crossing the threshold with a quiet confidence, his movement smooth and unhurried, as if he had already accepted what lay ahead. Ethan followed a step behind, feeling the subtle change beneath his boots. The ground here was neither wood nor stone, but something smoother, almost seamless, and as he entered fully, the opening behind him remained still, not closing but settling into place as if it had completed its purpose. The chamber they had left behind now felt like a memory, a step in a path that had led here, and as Ethan stood within this new space, the rhythm surrounding him, the soft light holding everything in a quiet balance, he realized that whatever this place was, whatever it had been built to hold, it was no longer hidden, not from him, not from Ranger, and not from the moment they had stepped into it. It was now part of their story, unfolding with a patience that asked for nothing more than to be witnessed, one step at a time. The moment Ethan stepped fully into the new chamber, the air seemed to settle around him in a way that felt almost aware, not watching, not judging, but holding his presence with a quiet acknowledgement. The soft light that filled the space did not come from a visible source. It seemed to exist within the surfaces themselves, diffused evenly across the curved walls, giving everything a gentle clarity that made shadows feel unnecessary. Ranger moved a few steps ahead, his gait smooth and unhurried, his tail low but steady, his ears angled forward as he approached the circular structure at the center. And as he drew closer, the rhythm became something more than sound. It became a sensation, a pulse that could be felt through the ground, through the air, through the space between breaths. Ethan followed, his steps slower now, not from hesitation but from a growing awareness that each movement mattered, that this place was not meant to be rushed through or understood all at once. The circular structure revealed itself more clearly as he approached, its surface smooth and slightly reflective, not like metal or stone, but something in between, something that carried a quiet permanence. It rose no more than 3 feet from the ground and spanned roughly 6 feet across, its edges perfectly rounded, its form uninterrupted by seams or joints, and at its center, a faint glow pulsed in time with the rhythm that filled the chamber, not bright enough to illuminate the room, but strong enough to draw the eye, to anchor attention. Ranger stopped just at the edge of it and sat, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on the center, and for a moment he did not move at all, not even a shift of breath, as if he had reached a point where movement was no longer necessary. Ethan stepped beside him, feeling the subtle vibration beneath his boots more clearly now. It traveled upward in a steady wave, not jarring, not overwhelming, but present, like the quiet hum of something functioning exactly as it was meant to. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to bring his eyes level with the surface, and as he did, the glow at the center responded, not by increasing in intensity, but by deepening in tone, becoming richer, more defined, as if it had been waiting for this proximity. He extended his hand slowly, not touching yet, just letting it hover a few inches above the surface, and immediately he felt the warmth, not hot, not sharp, but consistent, like the steady heat of something that had been active for a very long time without interruption. The rhythm aligned with that warmth, each pulse gentle but certain, and as he hovered there, he realized that the patterns carved into the walls behind him, the seams he had traced, the panels that had opened, they all led here, not just physically but intentionally. This was the center, the point where everything converged. Ranger let out a soft breath and shifted slightly, placing one paw forward, just touching the edge of the structure, and when he did, the glow responded again, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed, a slight expansion of light, a soft ripple that moved across the surface and then settled back into its steady pulse. Ethan watched that carefully, noting the timing, the reaction, the way the space itself seemed to adjust in response to contact. He lowered his hand a little more, until his fingertips brushed the surface lightly, and the moment they made contact, the rhythm deepened once more, not faster, not louder, but fuller, as if acknowledging the connection. The warmth spread through his fingers, into his palm, and for a brief second, the world above, the snow, the cabin, the barn, all of it faded into the background of his awareness, replaced by the quiet certainty of this moment, this place, this presence that did not demand anything from him except that he remain, that he listen, that he understand. Ranger leaned slightly closer, his head lowering until it rested near Ethan's arm, his presence steady, grounding, and together they remained there, not speaking, not moving, simply existing within the rhythm that filled the chamber. And as the seconds passed, something subtle began to shift, not in the structure itself, not in the light or the sound, but in Ethan, a realization forming slowly, not as a thought but as a feeling, that this was not something left behind, not something forgotten. This was something maintained, sustained, something that had continued on its own, through seasons, through years, through the silence of the world above. And now that it had been found, it was not asking to be taken or used. It was asking to be understood, to be witnessed, to be recognized for what it was, a place where time moved differently, where purpose did not fade, where something had been kept alive in a way that defied the passing of everything else. Ethan drew a slow breath and let it out, his hand still resting lightly on the surface. And in that quiet exchange, he understood that whatever this place was, it had not been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for someone who would come not out of curiosity alone, but out of need, out of patience, out of a willingness to listen. And now that he was here, with Ranger beside him and the world above buried in snow, that waiting had finally found its answer. The longer Ethan kept his hand against the surface, the more the rhythm seemed to settle into something familiar, not something he recognized with his mind, but something his body accepted without resistance, like the steady sound of rain on a roof or the distant roll of ocean waves. It did not demand attention. It became part of the silence itself, and in that silence, he began to notice something he had missed before. The light at the center was not just pulsing, it was changing in subtle ways, expanding slightly with each cycle, then drawing inward again, not random, not decorative, but precise, measured. As if it followed a pattern beyond simple repetition, Ranger shifted beside him, his head tilting slightly as he watched the same center point. Then he stood and took a slow step around the structure, his movement deliberate, tracing a path along the outer edge, his nose close to the surface, his ears flicking occasionally, as if catching something that moved just beyond. Hearing, Ethan lifted his hand and followed, standing now and walking alongside him, keeping a steady distance from the structure, observing it from a different angle. And as he moved, the perspective changed. The light revealed faint markings along the outer surface that had not been visible before, not carved like the ones in the tunnel, but embedded, as if they existed beneath the surface, forming shapes that only appeared when the light shifted just right, curved lines intersecting again. But this time they formed something closer to a map, or perhaps a sequence, something that guided not movement through space but through understanding. Ranger stopped at one point along the edge and looked back at Ethan, then down at the surface, then back again. A clear signal. Ethan stepped closer and knelt, angling his view to match the dog's. And there it was, a section where the pattern aligned differently, where the lines converged into a single point before spreading outward again. He reached out, not touching yet, just tracing the air above it. And as he did, the rhythm beneath the structure shifted ever so slightly, not in speed but in emphasis, as if that point held a different weight within the pattern. He placed his fingertips lightly against it, and immediately the light at the center responded, a soft expansion that traveled outward in a wave, reaching the edges before settling back into its steady pulse. Ranger exhaled quietly and lowered himself to the ground again, his body relaxed but attentive, as if confirming that this was the right place, the right action. Ethan kept his fingers there, feeling the warmth and the subtle vibration. And then he noticed something else. The pattern beneath his hand was not static. It was shifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lines adjusting, realigning, as if responding to his presence. To the point of contact, he drew his hand back slightly, and the pattern returned to its original form, steady, unchanged. Then he placed it again. And once more the shift occurred, subtle but undeniable, a response, a recognition. He stood, slowly, taking a step back to see the entire structure again. And as he did, the realization began to form, not as a sudden revelation but as a gradual understanding. This was not a machine, not in the way he had known machines. It did not operate on commands or inputs. It responded to presence, to alignment, to attention. It was something that required participation rather than control. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward the far side of the chamber, then back at Ethan, then toward the passage they had entered from. And for the first time since they had come down, Ethan became aware of the world above again, not through sound, but through absence. The faint echoes of wind and snow were gone completely now, replaced by a deeper stillness that suggested the storm had settled fully, sealing the surface, isolating this space entirely. He imagined the trench he had dug now buried under several feet of snow, the path erased, the cabin and barn standing alone in a white silence. And yet he did not feel trapped. He felt anchored, as if this place beneath the ground was not separate from the world above, but connected to it in a way he had not understood before. He turned back to the structure, to the steady rhythm, to the soft light that continued without interruption. And he realized that whatever this was, it had continued through countless winters, through storms far greater than this one, through time itself, unchanged, undisturbed, waiting not for rescue, not for discovery in the usual sense, but for someone who would arrive in the right way, at the right moment. With the right kind of attention, Ranger stood again and moved closer to Ethan, his body pressing lightly against his leg, grounding him in the present, reminding him that this was not something to be solved quickly, not something to be taken apart or explained away. It was something to be experienced, to be understood slowly, layer by layer, just as it had revealed itself so far. And as Ethan stood there, the rhythm steady, the lights soft and constant, the space holding them both in a quiet balance, he understood that this was only the beginning, that whatever this place truly was, whatever it held beyond what he could see now, it had only just started to show itself. And the deeper he went, the more it would ask of him, not in effort, but in patience, in presence, in the willingness to remain and listen as long as it took. The more Ethan stepped back and allowed himself to see the structure as a whole, the more it revealed something that had been impossible to notice up close. The rhythm was not just centered, it was layered, moving outward in subtle waves that touched different parts of the chamber at slightly different intervals, creating a quiet sequence that unfolded over time rather than repeating in place. He stood still, his breathing slowing as he matched that pattern without thinking, and in that stillness, something else emerged. The light along the walls, faint as it was, began to respond in kind, not brightening, not dimming, but shifting in tone, almost like a reflection of the central pulse reaching outward and then returning. Ranger remained close, his body angled slightly toward the structure, but his gaze now moved between the center and the walls, as if tracking both at once, as if he understood that what mattered was not just the source but how it moved through the space. Ethan followed that instinct and turned slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the rhythm of light and shadow, and that was when he noticed it, along the curved walls. The embedded patterns were no longer static, they were responding. Faint lines appearing and fading in sequence, tracing paths that mirrored the pulse, connecting one section of the chamber to another, not randomly, but with precision, like a map unfolding in time rather than space. He took a slow step to the side, and the pattern shifted with him, not following directly, but adjusting. As if his position influenced the way it revealed itself, he paused again, testing the stillness, and the lines settled, holding their place for a moment before continuing their quiet progression. Ranger moved then, circling once more, but this time his path aligned with the shifting patterns, his steps falling into a rhythm that matched the pulse beneath the floor. And as he moved, the lines along the walls responded more clearly, brightening slightly where he passed, then fading as he moved on. Ethan watched this carefully, the realization forming slowly. This was not a fixed system, it was interactive, responsive, not to commands, but to presence, to movement, to the way something existed within it rather than acted upon it. He stepped forward again, closer to the structure, and as he did, the patterns shifted once more, converging slightly toward the center, the rhythm deepening just enough to be felt more clearly through his chest. He placed his hand against the surface again, not out of curiosity now, but out of understanding, and the response came immediately. The pulse aligned. The light expanded outward in a soft wave, and the patterns along the walls followed, tracing a path that led from the center to a specific point along the far curve of the chamber. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a direction, a suggestion. Ranger stopped mid-step and turned his head toward that same point, his ears lifting slightly, his body still, as if confirming what Ethan had just seen. Ethan removed his hand and took a slow step in that direction, the ground beneath him carrying that same steady vibration, guiding without force. And as he moved, the patterns along the walls shifted ahead of him, not revealing everything at once, but opening gradually, like a path being drawn just ahead of his steps. Ranger moved beside him now. His pace matched, his presence steady. And together they approached the far side of the chamber, where the light seemed to gather just slightly more than anywhere else. The wall there curved inward more tightly, forming a shallow recess. And within it, another surface emerged, not separate from the wall but integrated into it, smoother, more refined, and marked with a continuation of the same patterns, though here they were more concentrated, more deliberate. Ethan stopped a few feet away, taking it in, letting the space settle around him again, and then he noticed the final detail that brought everything together. At the center of this recessed surface, there was no indentation, no handle, no seam, only a faint circular glow, smaller than the one at the central structure, but pulsing in perfect synchronization with it. A second point, a connection, a continuation of the same rhythm. He understood then that this was not a separate feature. It was part of the same system, the same presence, extending outward from the center to the edges, creating a network of connection rather than a single point of focus. Ranger stepped forward and sat once more, directly in front of the recessed surface, his posture calm, his gaze fixed on the small circle of light. Ethan followed, kneeling beside him, and for a moment they both remained still, listening, feeling, allowing the rhythm to settle fully into their awareness. And as it did, Ethan realized that this place was not just revealing itself to him. It was guiding him, step by step, not toward an end, but toward a deeper understanding of something that could not be rushed or forced, something that required him to remain present, to move with intention, to listen as much as he acted. And as the patterns along the walls continued their quiet movement, connecting center to edge, edge to center, he understood that whatever this place truly was, whatever purpose it served, he was now part of it, not as an intruder, but as a participant, drawn into its rhythm in a way that felt both unfamiliar and completely natural at the same time. The small circle of light on the recessed wall pulsed in perfect harmony with the larger one behind them. But now that Ethan stood close enough to feel both at once, he realized they were not identical. The rhythm matched, but the depth of each pulse carried a subtle difference, like two voices speaking the same words with different tones, one steady and foundational, the other lighter, responsive, as if echoing or translating something that could not be heard directly. He leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the smaller circle, and for a moment the rest of the chamber seemed to fall away, not disappearing, but quieting, allowing this single point to hold his attention fully. Ranger remained seated beside him, his posture unchanged, but his ears shifted slightly, angling toward the wall rather than the center behind them, as if he too recognized the importance of this second point. Ethan raised his hand slowly, not touching yet, remembering the way the structure had responded before, the way presence mattered more than force. And as his fingers hovered just inches from the glowing circle, the response came, subtle but immediate. The light deepened, not brighter, but richer, as if acknowledging his proximity, and the rhythm, though unchanged in pace, carried a new layer, a faint secondary pulse woven beneath the first, almost like a quiet answer to a question he had not spoken. He held his hand there, steady, letting the moment stretch, letting the space respond in its own time. And then he noticed something else. The patterns along the recessed surface were shifting again, but this time more clearly, the lines tracing outward from the circle, forming a shape that extended across the wall, connecting to the broader patterns of the chamber. And as they moved, they revealed something that had not been visible before, faint impressions embedded within the surface, not carvings, not markings, but something closer to memories. Outlines of objects, shapes that suggested presence without defining it, as if the wall itself held a record of what had once been here, or perhaps what this place had been built to preserve. Ethan felt a quiet tension rise within him, not fear, but anticipation, the sense that he was standing at the edge of understanding something just beyond his reach. Ranger shifted slightly, rising from his seated position and stepping closer to the wall, his nose lowering until it nearly touched the surface, his breath fogging faintly against the soft glow. Then he stepped back and looked at Ethan, a clear signal, a quiet encouragement. Ethan nodded almost without realizing it, and moved his hand the final inch forward, placing his fingertips gently against the center of the glowing circle. The response was immediate and complete. The rhythm deepened across the entire chamber, not louder, but fuller, filling every corner of the space with a presence that felt both grounding and expansive. The light beneath his hand spread outward in a smooth, continuous wave, traveling along the recessed surface, then outward into the walls of the chamber, tracing every pattern, every line, until the entire space seemed to come alive in a quiet, unified motion. And then, for the first time since he had entered, the air itself changed, not in temperature, but in texture, as if it carried something more than stillness, something that moved with the rhythm, something that held meaning beyond sound. Ethan did not pull his hand away. He let it remain there, feeling the connection deepen, and in that moment, the faint impressions along the wall began to sharpen, the outlines becoming clearer, not solid, not fully formed, but enough to suggest structure, shapes that resembled tools, containers, perhaps even figures, not detailed, not defined, but present in a way that felt intentional, as if the space was revealing layers of itself that had been hidden until now. Ranger remained still beside him, his body calm, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering, and together they stood there, at the point where the chamber no longer felt like a place to explore, but a place to witness, the rhythm continuing, the light moving, the patterns unfolding in a way that could not be rushed or fully understood in a single moment. And as Ethan stood there, his hand resting against the glowing surface, he realized that this was not the end of the path, not even close. This was a threshold, not of space, but of understanding, and whatever lay beyond it would not be revealed through action alone, but through the same patience, the same presence, the same willingness to remain and listen that had brought him this far. And as the chamber settled into its new rhythm, deeper and more complete than before, he understood that the next step would not be given to him. It would be something he would have to recognize, not with his eyes or his hands, but with something deeper, something that had been aligning with this place since the moment he first struck the frozen ground above. The moment the chamber settled into that deeper rhythm, something within Ethan shifted with it, not in thought, but in awareness, as if a part of him that had been quiet for years was beginning to listen again. His hand remained against the glowing surface, but now the connection felt different, not just contact, but alignment. The pulse beneath his fingertips no longer felt separate from his own. It moved with him, through him, steady and unhurried. And as he stood there, the faint impressions along the recessed wall began to take on a new clarity, not becoming solid, but more defined in their suggestion, shapes that resembled objects arranged with intention, tools placed carefully, containers sealed and preserved, and among them, something else, a space, an absence that carried meaning, as if something had once been there and had since moved, not removed, but completed. Ethan drew a slow breath, his chest rising in time with the rhythm, and for the first time he understood that this place was not showing him what it held, it was showing him what it had done. The patterns were not maps of location, they were records of process, cycles that had unfolded here, repeated over time, each one leaving behind a trace, a memory embedded within the structure itself. Ranger shifted beside him, not moving away, but adjusting his stance, his body turning slightly toward Ethan rather than the wall, his gaze lifting to meet his. And in that quiet exchange, there was something different. Not just awareness, but recognition, as if the dog sensed the change in him. The way his presence had deepened, Ethan lowered his hand slowly, and as it left the surface, the glow remained steady, the rhythm unchanged, but the connection lingered, not physical, but internal, like an echo that did not fade. He stepped back half a pace, giving himself space to see the entire recessed wall again. And this time the patterns did not shift immediately, they held, as if allowing him to take them in fully, and then, gradually, they began to move again, but not outward, not expanding. Instead they drew inward, converging toward the center point where his hand had been, the lines folding into themselves in a slow, deliberate motion, until the entire pattern resolved into a single, unified shape, simple, complete. And in that moment, the rhythm changed once more, not in pace, but in tone. It softened, becoming less like a pulse and more like a steady presence, something that no longer needed to announce itself because it had already been understood. Ethan felt that change settle through him, a quiet certainty replacing the earlier sense of searching. He looked around the chamber again. The central structure, the curved walls, the soft light that now felt less like illumination and more like atmosphere. And he realized that nothing here was asking for more. Nothing was waiting to be activated or revealed further. It had already given what it was meant to give. Ranger stepped closer and pressed lightly against his leg, his presence warm and steady. And together they stood there in the stillness that followed, not empty, not silent, but complete. Ethan turned slowly, looking back toward the passage they had come through, and for the first time, he noticed something he had not before. The faint glow of the chamber extended into the tunnel, softening the darkness, creating a path that no longer felt hidden or unknown, but familiar, as if it had always been there, waiting to be seen from this side. He took a step in that direction, then paused, turning back once more to the recessed wall, to the center point where the patterns had converged, and he understood then that this place was not meant to be left behind, not in the way other discoveries were. It did not belong to the past. It was not something to be taken or used. It was something that would remain, continuing as it always had, whether he stood here or not. But now, he carried it with him, not the structure, not the space, but the understanding it had given, the quiet alignment that had settled within him. Ranger moved ahead toward the passage, his steps confident, his ears relaxed, no longer searching, and Ethan followed, each step away from the chamber feeling different from the steps that had brought him in. Lighter, not because the place had lost its weight, but because he no longer needed to carry it as a question. The rhythm remained behind him, steady and unchanged, but its echo moved with him, subtle and constant. And as they reached the threshold where the chamber gave way to the tunnel, he paused once more, glancing back into the soft light, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the space acknowledged him in return, not with movement, not with change, but with a stillness that held meaning. And then he turned fully and continued forward, the path ahead no longer uncertain, the world above waiting beneath the weight of winter, and whatever came next, he would meet it with the same quiet presence that had led him here, step by step, into something that had not been waiting to be found, but to be understood. By the time Ethan reached the base of the steps, the difference between below and above had already begun to return, not as a shock, but as a gradual reintroduction of the world he had left behind. The air cooled with each step upward, the soft warmth fading into the sharper edge of winter, and the silence shifted as well, the deep, steady stillness of the chamber giving way to something more familiar, the faint creak of wood, the distant whisper of wind pressing against the land above. Ranger climbed ahead of him, his movements confident, his body relaxed in a way that spoke not of caution but of completion, as if whatever he had been listening for was no longer ahead, but already understood. Ethan followed slowly, one hand brushing lightly against the side of the passage, feeling the change in texture beneath his fingers, from the smooth surfaces of the deeper chamber back to the reinforced wood of the tunnel, then to the rougher edges of the original trench he had begun himself. And with each transition, the path behind him became clearer in his mind, not just as a route, but as a sequence of understanding, each layer revealing something, each step carrying him closer to a place that had not been marked on any map. When he reached the hatch, the cold air rushed in gently, not harsh, but undeniable, the scent of snow and pine filling his lungs, grounding him in the present moment. He pushed the hatch open fully and stepped out into the open space between the cabin and the barn, and for a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the world above. The landscape had transformed completely. The ground was buried under a thick blanket of snow, untouched and endless, stretching outward in every direction. The trees stood silent, their branches heavy and still, and the sky above was a muted gray, holding the weight of the storm that had passed. The trench he had dug was gone, erased entirely, no trace left behind, as if it had never existed at all. Ranger stepped out beside him and paused, his nose lifting slightly, taking in the air. Then he turned in a slow circle before settling at Ethan's side, his presence steady and familiar. Ethan looked from the cabin to the barn, the distance between them now hidden beneath the snow, a space that would have been difficult, even dangerous, to cross in these conditions, and yet he felt no urgency, no concern, because the path he had uncovered no longer depended on what could be seen above ground. It existed beneath, quiet and constant, untouched by the storm. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath drift into the cold air, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape the world, but to feel it more clearly, the wind brushing lightly against his face, the weight of the cold settling into his coat, the steady presence of Ranger beside him, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the echo of that rhythm, no longer surrounding him, but within him, subtle and steady, like a memory that did not fade. He opened his eyes again and looked toward the barn, then toward the cabin, and without hesitation he stepped forward, his boots pressing into the fresh snow, leaving the first marks on an untouched surface. Ranger moved with him, matching his pace, his steps sure and unhurried, and together they crossed the distance, not guided by sight, but by the quiet certainty of the path that now existed beneath them. When they reached the cabin, Ethan paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle for a brief moment before opening it. The familiar interior greeted him, unchanged, simple, the small fire he had left earlier now reduced to glowing embers, casting a soft light across the room. He stepped inside, Ranger following close behind, and closed the door gently against the cold. The quiet of the cabin settled around them, different from the silence below, but no less complete. Ethan removed his gloves slowly and set them on the table, then stood for a moment, looking around the space as if seeing it for the first time, not as a place of survival, but as part of something larger, something connected. He moved to the hearth and knelt, adding a small piece of wood to the embers, watching as the flame returned, steady and warm, and as it did, he felt that same quiet alignment settle within him again, not something he needed to hold on to, but something that remained on its own. Ranger lay down near the fire, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but aware, present, and Ethan sat back on his heels, his gaze resting on the small flame, the sound of the fire soft and steady, and in that moment, there was no need to explain what had happened, no need to define it or give it meaning beyond what it already held. It had not changed the world around him. The snow still covered the land, the winter still pressed in from all sides, but something within him had shifted, something quiet and certain, and as the fire grew, casting its light across the walls of the cabin, he understood that whatever lay beneath the ground would remain there, continuing in its own time, but he would carry its rhythm with him, not as a mystery to solve, but as a reminder that some paths are not built to lead us somewhere new, but to return us to something we had forgotten, something steady, something patient, something that waits, not to be found, but to be understood.